Chief of surgery fires the most competent nurse on his floor, not knowing who she really is. Dad, they fired me from your hospital. What could make a decorated department head go completely silent in front of his entire medical staff? A confident supervisor demotes a young black nurse for insubordination after she questions his medical judgment. His authority seems absolute until she makes one phone call that systematically destroys not just his career, but exposes decades of discrimination he thought was safely hidden. Who is she? And why does her calm professionalism make seasoned doctors so uncomfortable? Because Dr. Sterling thought he was dealing with just another nurse who could be intimidated into silence. He was dead wrong. This is the story of how one man's prejudice collided with someone carrying a very dangerous family connection, and how a fight for professional respect became a war that would transform an entire hospital system. Let's dive into it. If you believe that Maya deserved to be treated with the same respect as every other healthcare professional, type respect below. The early morning sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Metropolitan General Hospital, casting long shadows across the polished marble lobby. Located in Manhattan's Upper East Side, Metropolitan General was where New York's elite came for treatment, where medical miracles happened daily, and where careers were made or destroyed with surgical precision. On the 8th floor, the cardiology unit hummed with controlled energy. Monitors beeped rhythmically, nurses moved with practiced efficiency, and the air carried the distinctive scent of antiseptic mixed with quiet tension that accompanies life and death decisions made every hour. Maya Washington stepped out of the elevator at exactly 6:47 a.m., her crisp white uniform perfectly pressed, her natural hair pulled back in a neat bun. At 21, she possessed an unusual quality that made people take notice without understanding why. It wasn't just her competence, though she was undeniably skilled for someone so young. It was something deeper, a quiet confidence that seemed incongruous with her official position as a registered nurse who had been working at Metropolitan General for exactly 6 months. Her intelligent eyes moved across the unit with precision, cataloging every detail. To casual observers, she appeared to be just another dedicated nurse beginning her shift. But those paying closer attention might have noticed something unusual, the way she moved through the hospital with familiarity that seemed impossible for someone so new, and the way she spoke with attending physicians without the intimidation most young nurses displayed. "Morning, Maya," called Janet Rodriguez, a veteran nurse who had been working the cardiac unit for 15 years. Janet had seen hundreds of nurses come and go, but Maya Washington had caught her attention from day one. There was something different about her, a competence that went beyond excellent technical skills. Maya approached the nurses' station with fluid movements that suggested both professionalism and an almost military bearing. "Good morning, Janet. How was the night shift? Any emergencies I should know about?" "Room 802 needs vitals, and Dr. Sterling wants those medication reconciliation forms completed before rounds," Janet replied, studying Maya's face. "Mrs. Patterson in 802 had some irregular heartbeat issues around 3 a.m. Nothing too serious, but we've been monitoring." Maya nodded, already pulling up patient charts on her tablet with familiarity that seemed almost instinctive. "Mrs. Patterson's file shows she's on digitalis for her heart condition. Did anyone check her potassium levels? Hypokalemia can cause dangerous interactions with cardiac glycosides." Janet paused, looking up from her charts. In 15 years of nursing, she had rarely heard a staff nurse speak with such clinical precision about cardiac medications. Most nurses Maya's age focused on tasks and procedures. They didn't typically think in terms of drug interactions. "How did you know about the potassium interaction?" Janet asked, her curiosity fully engaged. "That wasn't covered in our nursing orientation." Maya's response was casual, but Janet caught something in her tone, a confidence that suggested deeper knowledge. Cardiac pharmacology is fascinating once you understand the underlying mechanisms. Digitalis works by inhibiting the sodium-potassium pump, so when potassium levels are low, the drug becomes much more potent. As Maya walked toward room 802, Janet watched her with growing fascination. Maya wasn't just competent, she was displaying clinical thinking that typically took years to develop. She understood not just what to do, but why to do it. She moved through the hospital with familiarity that suggested intimate knowledge of the entire institution. Doctor. Richard Sterling, the supervising physician for the cardiac unit, had been watching Maya Washington since her first day. At 48, Sterling had built his career on maintaining order, following established hierarchies, and ensuring that everyone, especially nurses, understood their place in the medical ecosystem. Maya Washington troubled him in ways he couldn't articulate. She was too confident for a young black nurse, too comfortable questioning medical decisions, too willing to engage in clinical discussions beyond her scope of practice. And there was something in the way she looked at him, not with deference he expected, but with cool assessment that made him profoundly uncomfortable. From his office overlooking the cardiac unit, Sterling watched Maya complete her rounds with efficiency that should have impressed him, but instead increased his irritation. She moved from patient to patient with obvious competence, but she also took time to explain procedures to families and coordinate care in ways that suggested she understood each patient's broader treatment plan. Sterling picked up Maya's personnel file from his desk, reviewing it for the 20th time. Maya Elizabeth Washington, age 21, graduated summa cum laude from Columbia University's nursing program. References described her as exceptionally capable and possessing unusual clinical insight, but there was something missing from the file that nagged at Sterling. Her credentials were outstanding, yet there was a quality about her that suggested experiences and knowledge not reflected in any official documentation. "Washington," Sterling's voice cut across the unit as Maya finished checking Mrs. Patterson's vitals. His tone carried authority mixed with irritation that had been building for 6 months. Maya saved her notes and turned towards Sterling's voice, her movement unhurried despite the obvious tension. Other nurses stopped their work to watch, sensing something significant was about to happen. But what they didn't know was that Maya Washington possessed knowledge that would make this confrontation unlike anything Dr. Sterling had ever faced. But there was something different about Maya Washington that would soon become impossible to ignore. Dr. Sterling's office reflected his personality perfectly, meticulously organized, filled with medical journals, and dominated by diplomas proclaiming his authority. His desk was positioned so visitors had to look up at him, a psychological advantage he had learned early in his career. "Sit down, Washington," he said without looking up, continuing to shuffle papers for 30 seconds, a power play designed to establish dominance. Maya settled into the chair, her posture relaxed but alert. She waited patiently while Sterling performed his display of importance, her dark eyes reading his micro-expressions with analytical precision. Finally, Sterling looked up, his pale blue eyes fixing on Maya with obvious disapproval. "I've been reviewing your work over the past 6 months, Washington, and I have serious concerns about your approach to patient care." Maya's expression remained neutral. "What kind of concerns, Dr. Sterling? Your approach seems to exceed your scope of practice. Yesterday, you questioned Dr. Harrison's medication orders for the patient in room 815. You spent 15 minutes discussing cardiac pharmacology with the patient's family. This goes well beyond standard nursing protocols." Sterling leaned back, studying Maya's reaction. In his experience, young nurses became defensive when confronted with criticism. They apologized and accepted guidance with appropriate humility. Maya Washington did none of those things. "The patient in room 815 was showing early signs of digoxin toxicity, Dr. Sterling. His potassium levels were critically low, and increasing the cardiac glycoside dose could have caused fatal arrhythmias. I thought it was important to flag the potential drug interaction." Sterling's face flushed slightly. Maya's explanation was medically sophisticated. "Dr. Harrison had in fact adjusted the medication order, exactly as Maya had suggested, and the patient's condition had improved significantly. But that wasn't the point. A nurse, especially a young black nurse, should not be making those kinds of clinical observations." "That's exactly what I'm talking about," Sterling said, his voice sharpening. "You're overstepping boundaries. Nurses don't diagnose drug toxicity. Nurses don't question physician orders unless specifically requested, and nurses certainly don't presume to understand complex cardiac pharmacology." Maya studied Sterling's face with trained precision, cataloging his defensive body language, and the tremor in his voice indicating emotional escalation. "I understand the hierarchy, Dr. Sterling. But patient safety has to be the primary consideration. If I see something that could harm a patient, I have an ethical obligation to speak up. Ethical obligation? Sterling's voice rose. Your ethical obligation is to follow orders and stay in your lane. This isn't nursing school, Washington. This is a real hospital with real consequences, and your job is to do what you're told, not to think you're some kind of medical detective. The condescension was unmistakable, carrying undertones about who belonged in positions of medical authority. Maya had heard similar tones throughout her life, the dismissiveness reserved for young black women who demonstrated competence in spaces where they weren't expected to excel. I understand your concerns, Dr. Sterling. I'll be more mindful of proper channels for reporting clinical observations. However, I will never compromise patient safety to avoid challenging hierarchical boundaries. It was diplomatic, but Sterling caught something that irritated him further. There was no apology, no acknowledgement that she had been wrong, no sign of intimidation. Maya looked at him with calm assessment, as if evaluating his position on merit rather than accepting it based on rank. Let me be clear, Washington, Sterling said, leaning forward. Your job is to take vital signs, administer medications as prescribed, and follow protocols established by senior staff. It is not to play doctor, interrogate treatment decisions, or demonstrate how much medical knowledge you think you have. Maya remained silent, but Sterling noticed something in her eyes. Not defiance exactly, but a kind of patient endurance, as if she were dealing with someone whose authority she recognized but didn't particularly respect. Furthermore, Sterling continued, your attitude is becoming disruptive to unit morale. Other nurses are starting to question established procedures because they see you overstepping boundaries without consequences. That stops now. I've never encouraged anyone to violate protocols, Dr. Sterling. When colleagues ask questions about patient care, I try to provide accurate information based on current medical literature. That's not your role. Sterling's voice cracked slightly. Your role is to support physicians, not to educate them or second-guess their decisions. If you can't understand that basic principle, then perhaps you're not suited for nursing at Metropolitan General. The threat hung in the air. Maya's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her posture. A subtle straightening that suggested she was preparing for whatever came next. I understand perfectly, Dr. Sterling. Is there anything else you'd like to discuss? Sterling stared at her for a long moment, frustrated by her refusal to be intimidated. Most employees would have been apologizing by now, promising to modify their behavior, showing appropriate deference to his authority. Just remember what we talked about, Washington. I'll be watching your performance very carefully from now on. Maya stood smoothly. Of course, Dr. Sterling, I appreciate your feedback. As she left his office, Sterling watched her go with growing irritation. Maya Washington was becoming a problem that needed to be solved. What happened next would change everything. Little did Sterling know that his attempt to intimidate Maya Washington would soon backfire in ways he never imagined. The afternoon shift change at Metropolitan General always brought increased activity, as day staff updated night staff on patient conditions, medication schedules, and special concerns. Maya was completing her notes when the cardiac monitors in room 807 began alarming, the sharp, insistent beeping that indicated a patient in distress. Maya immediately moved toward the room, her training taking over as she assessed the situation. Mr. Chen, a 73-year-old man recovering from bypass surgery, was experiencing rapid, irregular heartbeat patterns that could indicate dangerous arrhythmias. His rhythm's unstable, Maya called to Janet, who was preparing medications at the nurse's station. Blood pressure's dropping to 90/60, and he's showing signs of decreased cardiac output. Maya quickly reviewed Mr. Chen's chart on her tablet while monitoring his vital signs. His medication list showed he was receiving amiodarone for rhythm control, but the dosing seemed aggressive for someone his age with his kidney function levels. Doctor. Harrison appeared in the doorway, alerted by the monitor alarms. What's the situation? Mr. Chen's showing signs of cardiac instability, Maya reported. His rhythm has been irregular for the past 5 minutes, and his blood pressure is dropping. I'm concerned about the amiodarone dosing. His creatinine levels suggest reduced kidney function, which could be causing drug accumulation. Doctor. Harrison checked the monitors himself, then reviewed the medication orders on his tablet. You think the amiodarone is causing toxicity? It's possible. His symptoms started about 4 hours after his last dose, and the timing suggests drug-related arrhythmias rather than surgical complications. Dr. Harrison nodded, already making adjustments to the medication protocol. Good catch. We'll reduce the dose and monitor his electrolytes more closely. But their conversation was interrupted by Dr. Sterling's arrival. He had been making rounds when he heard the commotion and came to investigate. His expression darkened when he saw Maya discussing treatment options with Dr. Harrison. "What's going on here?" Sterling demanded, his tone suggesting he already disapproved of whatever he was witnessing. "Doctor." Harrison looked up from adjusting Mr. Chen's medication pump. Maya identified possible drug toxicity. "We're modifying the amiodarone protocol." Sterling's jaw tightened. "Washington, step outside. I need to speak with you." Maya glanced at Mr. Chen, whose cardiac rhythm was beginning to stabilize with the medication adjustment. "Dr. Sterling, I'd like to continue monitoring now, Washington." In the hallway, Sterling's anger was barely contained. "Did I not make myself clear this morning about overstepping boundaries? Dr. Sterling, the patient was in distress. I identified a potential cause and reported it to the attending physician. That's standard nursing protocol." Standard nursing protocol is to report observations, not to diagnose drug toxicity and recommend treatment modifications. You don't have the training or authority to make those kinds of clinical assessments. Maya remained calm, but her voice carried a slight edge. The patient's symptoms were consistent with amiodarone toxicity. Given his age and kidney function, dose reduction was the appropriate response. Dr. Harrison agreed with the assessment. "Dr. Harrison is not the issue here," Sterling snapped. "You are. You seem to think you're qualified to practice medicine without a medical degree, and that attitude is dangerous. Patient safety should be everyone's priority, regardless of their position in the hierarchy." Sterling stepped closer, lowering his voice to a threatening whisper. "Let me explain something to you, Washington. This hospital operates on a chain of command that has worked successfully for over a century. Nurses who think they know better than physicians don't last long here, especially nurses who forget their place." The racial undertones were unmistakable. Maya had heard similar language before, the coded phrases that suggested some people naturally belonged in positions of authority, while others should be grateful for whatever opportunities they were given. "I understand the chain of command, Dr. Sterling, but I also understand that every healthcare professional has a responsibility to advocate for patient safety. Your responsibility is to do your job and nothing more. If you can't accept that, then maybe you should consider finding employment somewhere more suited to your particular approach to nursing." Other staff members had stopped their work to listen to the increasingly heated exchange. Maya was aware of their attention, but she refused to be intimidated by Sterling's attempt to humiliate her publicly. "Are you questioning my competence, Dr. Sterling?" "I'm questioning your judgment and your ability to function effectively within established protocols. Today's incident demonstrates exactly what I was concerned about this morning." Dr. Harrison emerged from Mr. Chen's room, clearly uncomfortable with the confrontation taking place in the hallway. "Excuse me, Dr. Sterling, but I wanted to thank Maya for her observation. Mr. Chen's rhythm has stabilized, and his blood pressure is returning to normal ranges. Her assessment may have prevented a serious cardiac event." Sterling's face flushed with anger and embarrassment. The last thing he wanted was for Dr. Harrison to publicly validate Maya's clinical judgment, especially after he had just finished criticizing her competence. "Dr. Harrison, I appreciate your feedback, but nursing staff accountability is my responsibility. I'll handle this matter appropriately." As Dr. Harrison walked away, Sterling turned back to Maya with undisguised hostility. "This conversation isn't over, Washington. I'm documenting today's incident in your personnel file." Maya watched Sterling return to his office, knowing that the confrontation had escalated beyond professional disagreement into something more personal and dangerous. What she didn't know was that Sterling was already planning to use the next opportunity to end her employment at Metropolitan General permanently. What happened next would change everything Maya thought she knew about fighting institutional prejudice. Over the next 2 weeks, Maya noticed subtle but unmistakable changes in how she was treated at Metropolitan General. Her schedule was modified to include the most difficult shifts, nights, weekends, and holidays that other nurses typically avoided. Her patient assignments became increasingly complex, involving the most challenging cases that required constant attention and left little time for meal breaks or rest. Dr. Sterling's scrutiny became relentless. He reviewed her documentation with microscopic attention, questioning every decision, every notation, every interaction with patients and families. Where other nurses might receive constructive feedback about their performance, Maya received formal written critiques that were placed in her personnel file. "Maya," Janet approached her during a rare quiet moment in the cardiac unit, "can I ask you something personal?" Maya looked up from the patient charts she was reviewing, noting the concern in Janet's expression. "Of course. What did you do to make Sterling so determined to make your life miserable? I've been here 15 years, and I've never seen him target someone like this." Maya considered her response carefully. She had been aware of Sterling's campaign against her, but hearing it confirmed by a colleague made the situation feel more serious. "I think, Dr. Sterling and I have different philosophies about patient care and professional boundaries. This goes beyond philosophical differences," Janet said quietly. "He's building a case against you. The schedule changes, the difficult assignments, the constant documentation. He's trying to create a pattern that justifies termination. Have you seen this before?" "Twice. Both times with nurses who challenged the established order in ways that made Sterling uncomfortable. Both times those nurses ended up leaving Metropolitan General." Maya absorbed this information with the calm analysis that had become her trademark. What happened to them? One was an older nurse who questioned medication protocols that hadn't been updated in years. She was right, but Sterling made her life so difficult that she transferred to another hospital. The other was a young male nurse who suggested changes to patient discharge procedures. He lasted 8 months before he found another job. And Sterling faced no consequences for driving away competent staff. Janet glanced around to make sure they weren't being overheard. "Sterling has been here 12 years. He knows how to work the system, how to document problems in ways that protect him legally. Unless someone with real authority challenges him, he can make anyone's career very difficult." That afternoon, Maya's suspicions about Sterling's campaign were confirmed when she was called to a meeting with Patricia Manning, the hospital's director of nursing. Manning's office was located on the administrative floor, away from patient care areas, and decorated with the kind of neutral corporate aesthetics that suggested serious business was conducted there. "Please sit down, Maya," Manning said, gesturing to a chair across from her desk. Her tone was professional but carried undertones of disappointment that suggested the meeting would not be pleasant. Manning opened a thick folder that Maya recognized as her personnel file. "I've been reviewing reports about your performance over the past few weeks, and I'm concerned about some patterns I'm seeing." Maya remained silent, waiting to hear the specific accusations that Sterling had compiled against her. "Doctor, Sterling has documented multiple incidents where you've exceeded your scope of practice, questioned physician authority, and disrupted unit protocols. These are serious concerns that affect not just your own performance, but the functioning of the entire cardiac unit. May I ask what specific incidents you're referring to?" Manning consulted the file. "On March 15th, you diagnosed drug toxicity in a patient and recommended treatment modifications without consulting the attending physician first. On March 18th, you spent unauthorized time educating a patient's family about cardiac procedures that should have been explained by medical staff. On March 22nd, you questioned established medication protocols during a team meeting." Maya recognized each incident, but Manning's descriptions made her actions sound insubordinate rather than patient-focused. "In each case, I was advocating for patient safety and providing information that families needed to understand their loved one's care. I understand your intentions may have been good, Maya, but intentions aren't enough in a hospital environment. We have established procedures and hierarchies for reasons. When those boundaries are violated, it creates confusion and undermines the authority structure that keeps patients safe." Maya found herself in an impossible position. Everything she had done was medically appropriate and ethically justified, but Sterling had successfully reframed her competence as insubordination. Ms. Manning, I've never compromised patient safety or violated any hospital policies. My clinical knowledge and patient advocacy should be seen as assets, not problems. Your clinical knowledge isn't in question, Maya. Your judgment about when and how to apply that knowledge is the concern. Dr. Sterling has been practicing medicine for over 20 years. His experience and authority need to be respected. Maya realized that Manning had already decided the outcome of this meeting. The discussion was not about facts or fairness. It was about reinforcing institutional hierarchies that Sterling had convinced management were being threatened. What are you asking me to do? I'm placing you on probationary status for the next 60 days. During this period, you will receive additional supervision and guidance about appropriate professional boundaries. If these performance issues continue, we'll have to consider more serious disciplinary actions. Maya left Manning's office knowing that Sterling had successfully weaponized the hospital's bureaucracy against her. The probationary status would be used to justify whatever action he decided to take next. But what Sterling didn't understand was that his campaign of harassment was about to backfire in ways he never imagined. That's when Dr. Sterling made the worst mistake of his medical career. The call came at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday night, when Maya was working her third consecutive night shift. Metropolitan General's emergency department had received a trauma patient, a 45-year-old construction worker who had suffered a massive heart attack at a job site and been transported by ambulance with CPR in progress. Maya was assigned to assist with the emergency admission, working alongside Dr. Patricia Chen, the attending cardiologist on call. The patient, identified as Robert Martinez, was unconscious and in critical condition, requiring immediate intervention to save his life. We need to get him to the cardiac catheterization lab immediately, Doctor. Chen announced as the trauma team worked to stabilize Martinez's vital signs. He's showing signs of massive anterior wall MI with possible cardiogenic shock. Maya quickly reviewed Martinez's initial lab results and EKG readings, noting several concerning patterns that suggested the heart attack was more complex than initially apparent. His cardiac enzymes were extremely elevated, indicating significant muscle damage, but there were also signs of electrolyte imbalances that could complicate treatment. Doctor. Chen, Maya said quietly, his potassium level is critically low at 2.4, and his magnesium is also depleted. Should we correct these before the catheterization procedure? Dr. Chen looked at the lab results Maya had flagged. Good catch. Yes, we need to address the electrolyte abnormalities first. The low potassium could cause dangerous arrhythmias during the procedure. As they worked to stabilize Martinez's condition, Maya noticed Dr. Sterling entering the cardiac unit. He was not scheduled to be on call, but he occasionally appeared during major emergencies, ostensibly to provide additional supervision, but often to assert his authority over situations he hadn't been involved in managing. What's the status? Sterling demanded, inserting himself into the treatment team without invitation. Dr. Chen briefed him on Martinez's condition and their treatment plan. We're correcting electrolyte imbalances before proceeding to the catheterization lab. The patient's potassium and magnesium levels were dangerously low. Sterling reviewed the chart, his expression growing disapproving as he noticed Maya's involvement in identifying the lab abnormalities. Who ordered the additional lab work? I did, based on Maya's observation of the initial results, Dr. Chen replied. She identified the electrolyte problems that could have complicated the procedure. Sterling's jaw tightened. Here was another example of Maya Washington overstepping her boundaries, making clinical observations that went beyond her nursing responsibilities. But more problematically, she had been right again, and her intervention had likely prevented serious complications. Washington, I need to speak with you, Sterling said, his tone leaving no room for discussion. Maya glanced at Martinez, whose condition was still critical. Dr. Sterling, I'd prefer to stay with the patient until he's stable. The patient is Dr. Chen's responsibility. You're coming with me now. In the hallway, Sterling's anger was barely controlled. This is exactly what we discussed, Washington. You're making clinical assessments that are beyond your scope of practice and undermining the established treatment protocols. Dr. Sterling, the patient's lab values indicated life-threatening electrolyte imbalances. Identifying those abnormalities prevented potential cardiac arrest during the procedure. That's not your determination to make. You're a nurse, not a physician. Your job is to report lab values, not to interpret them or recommend treatment modifications. Maya remained calm, but she could see that Sterling's hostility had reached a dangerous level. His criticism was no longer about professional boundaries. It was about maintaining hierarchies that he felt she was threatening simply by being competent. Patient safety should be everyone's priority, Maya said simply. Patient safety is the physician's responsibility, not yours. And frankly, I'm tired of your attitude and your refusal to accept appropriate professional limitations. Sterling moved closer, lowering his voice to ensure their conversation remained private. Let me be very clear, Washington. You have two choices. You can modify your behavior to comply with established protocols and acknowledge that your job is to follow orders, not give them. Or you can find employment elsewhere. Maya studied Sterling's face, recognizing that he had moved beyond professional criticism into personal vendetta. Are you threatening my job, Dr. Sterling? I'm explaining your options. The probationary period gives me authority to recommend termination if performance issues continue. Tonight's incident will be documented as another example of overstepping boundaries. Saving a patient's life is overstepping boundaries. Sterling's face flushed with anger. Thinking you saved a patient's life when you simply reported lab values is exactly the kind of arrogance I'm talking about, Doctor. Chen would have identified those abnormalities during her own review. Maya realized that Sterling was beyond rational discussion. In his mind, her competence was a threat that needed to be eliminated, regardless of patient outcomes or medical ethics. I understand your position, Dr. Sterling. I hope you do, because the next incident will be your last. As Maya returned to the cardiac unit, she knew that Sterling was planning to manufacture a reason to fire her. His hostility had escalated beyond professional disagreement into something personal and dangerous. What she didn't know was that Robert Martinez's case would provide Sterling with exactly the opportunity he was looking for. But Maya had been preparing for this moment her entire life. 3 days after the Martinez emergency, Maya arrived for her morning shift to find Dr. Sterling waiting at the nurses' station with Patricia Manning and 2 other administrators she didn't recognize. Their expressions were serious, and several other nurses had stopped their work to observe what was clearly an official proceeding. "Washington, please join us in the conference room," Manning announced, her tone carrying the finality of someone who had already made difficult decisions. The conference room was normally used for patient care meetings and staff education, but today it felt like a courtroom. Sterling sat at the head of the table with a thick folder of documents, while Manning and the administrators flanked him on either side. Maya took the single chair that had been placed across from them, recognizing the psychological positioning designed to make her feel isolated and defensive. "Maya," Manning began, "we've called this meeting to address serious concerns about your performance during the Martinez case 3 nights ago." Maya remained silent, waiting to hear the accusations that Sterling had constructed. Sterling opened his folder and began reading from prepared notes. "On the night of March 28th, you violated several hospital protocols during the treatment of emergency patient Robert Martinez. First, you made unauthorized clinical assessments of laboratory values without physician supervision. Second, you recommended treatment modifications that exceeded your scope of practice. Third, you questioned established emergency protocols in ways that disrupted the treatment team's effectiveness." Maya listened to Sterling's charges, recognizing how he had twisted her actions into violations of hospital policy. "Dr. Sterling, I identified critically low electrolyte levels that could have caused cardiac arrest during the catheterization procedure. Dr. Chen agreed with my assessment and modified the treatment plan accordingly." "Dr. Chen's decisions are not the issue here," Sterling replied. "Your assumption of medical authority is the problem. You diagnosed electrolyte imbalances and recommended treatment protocols as if you were the attending physician." Manning consulted her own notes. Maya, this incident follows a pattern of similar violations that we've discussed previously. The probationary status was intended to help you understand appropriate professional boundaries, but these behaviors have continued. Maya realized that she was facing a predetermined outcome. Sterling had successfully convinced hospital administration that her clinical competence represented insubordination rather than good patient care. "May I ask about Mr. Martinez's current condition?" Maya asked. Sterling's expression hardened. "The patient's outcome is not relevant to this disciplinary proceeding." "Actually, it is relevant," Maya replied, her voice carrying a new edge of determination. "Mr. Martinez made a full recovery specifically because the electrolyte imbalances were corrected before the procedure. If those lab values had been ignored, he could have died from cardiac arrhythmias." "That's exactly the kind of medical opinion you're not qualified to offer," Sterling snapped. "You're a nurse, not a cardiologist. You don't determine what saves patients' lives." Maya looked directly at Sterling, her calm composure masking a growing resolve. "Doctor." "Sterling, I've been patient with your campaign against me because I hoped you would eventually recognize that competent patient care should be valued regardless of who provides it. But you're more interested in maintaining hierarchies than in patient outcomes." Sterling leaned forward, his anger finally erupting. "Your arrogance is exactly what I'm talking about. You think you know better than physicians with decades of experience. You think you can question medical authority without consequences. Well, you're wrong." Manning intervened before the confrontation could escalate further. "Maya, after reviewing your performance issues and this latest incident, we've decided to terminate your employment at Metropolitan General, effective immediately." The words hung in the air for a moment. Maya had expected this outcome, but hearing it officially announced still carried emotional impact. "You're firing me for providing excellent patient care and advocating for patient safety." Sterling stood up abruptly, his face flushed with vindication. "We're firing you for insubordination, for exceeding your scope of practice, and for refusing to accept appropriate professional limitations. Your employment here is terminated." Maya remained seated, her expression calm despite the magnitude of what was happening. Around the table, the administrators looked uncomfortable but unwilling to challenge Sterling's assessment. "I see," Maya said quietly. "So this is how Metropolitan General handles nurses who save patients' lives." Sterling's triumph was evident in his voice. "This is how we handle employees who don't know their place." Maya stood slowly, her movement deliberate and controlled. The phrase "don't know their place" carried racial undertones that everyone in the room recognized, but no one was willing to acknowledge directly. "Dr. Sterling, you've made a very serious mistake." Sterling laughed, actually laughed at her statement. "The only mistake here was hiring you in the first place. Security will escort you out of the building." Maya reached into her pocket and pulled out her cell phone, her fingers moving with calm precision as she dialed a number everyone could see on the screen. The room fell silent as the call connected. "Dad," Maya said, her voice carrying across the conference room with absolute clarity, "they fired me from your hospital. What they didn't know would destroy everything." The silence that followed Maya's phone call was absolute. Sterling's triumphant expression froze on his face as the implications of her words began to register. Manning and the other administrators exchanged confused glances, unsure of what they had just witnessed. "Your hospital?" Sterling repeated, his voice cracking slightly. Maya held the phone so everyone could hear the deep, authoritative voice that responded. "Maya, sweetheart, tell me exactly what happened. Take your time and give me all the details." "Doctor." Victor Washington's voice carried the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. As chief of surgery at Metropolitan General for 15 years, his reputation extended far beyond the hospital's walls. He was recognized nationally as one of America's leading cardiac surgeons, had published groundbreaking research in medical journals, and had personally trained dozens of physicians who now worked at prestigious hospitals across the country. Maya looked directly at Sterling as she responded to her father. "Dr. Sterling just terminated my employment for providing excellent patient care and advocating for patient safety. He claims that identifying life-threatening lab abnormalities and preventing cardiac complications constitutes insubordination. Sterling's face had gone completely white. The woman he had just fired for not knowing her place was the daughter of the most powerful physician in the hospital, his ultimate superior and the person who could end his career with a single word. Dr. Ika. Victor Washington's voice filled the conference room through Maya's phone speaker, carrying the calm authority that had made him one of the most respected surgeons in America. Doctor. Sterling, I assume you're present for this conversation. Sterling tried to speak, but no words came out. His mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, while sweat began beading on his forehead, despite the conference room's air conditioning. I'm here, Dr. Washington, Manning finally managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. Patricia, I'm disappointed that this situation reached this point without my knowledge. My daughter has been working in your cardiac unit for 6 months, providing exceptional patient care, while enduring systematic harassment that should never have been tolerated. Maya continued her report with clinical precision. Over the past 2 weeks, Dr. Sterling has subjected me to schedule manipulation, excessive documentation requirements, and increasingly hostile confrontations. Today's termination was the culmination of a campaign designed to drive me out of the hospital. Victor's voice hardened perceptibly. Dr. Sterling, I've been chief of surgery at this hospital for 15 years. In that time, I've built Metropolitan General's cardiac program into one of the finest in America. I've recruited talented physicians, implemented cutting-edge procedures, and maintained standards of excellence that have saved thousands of lives. Sterling finally found his voice, though it came out as a strangled whisper. Dr. Washington, I didn't know. She never said. She never said she was my daughter because she wanted to be evaluated on her own merits, not on her family connections. Maya chose to work under her mother's maiden name so that her competence would be judged fairly, without the advantages or disadvantages that come with being the chief of surgery's daughter. The irony was devastating. Sterling had spent months attacking Maya's competence, never realizing that her medical knowledge came from growing up in the household of one of America's most respected cardiac surgeons. Her familiarity with the hospital, her clinical insights, her calm professionalism under pressure, all of it made perfect sense now. Dr. Sterling, Victor continued, you terminated my daughter for demonstrating exactly the kind of clinical excellence that I've spent 15 years trying to cultivate in this institution. Her identification of electrolyte abnormalities in the Martinez case prevented a potentially fatal complication. Her advocacy for patient safety exemplifies the highest standards of medical ethics. Manning cleared her throat nervously. Dr. Washington, if we had known Maya was your daughter, this situation would have been handled very differently. That's exactly the problem, Patricia. The fact that you would treat a competent healthcare professional differently based on her family connections rather than her clinical performance reveals systematic failures in how this hospital evaluates and supports its staff. Maya had remained quiet during her father's response, but now she spoke with the same measured authority that had characterized her throughout the confrontation. Dad, this isn't just about me, Doctor. Sterling's behavior represents a broader pattern of discrimination that affects other staff members who don't have family connections to protect them. Victor's voice carried grim determination. Maya, I want you to document every incident of discrimination you've experienced, every witness to inappropriate behavior, and every example of retaliation you've faced. We're going to conduct a comprehensive review of personnel practices in the cardiac unit. Sterling had slumped in his chair, the full magnitude of his mistake beginning to register. He had built his career on understanding hospital hierarchies and maintaining relationships with powerful physicians. Now he had systematically harassed and ultimately fired the daughter of the most influential doctor in the institution. Dr. Washington, Sterling stammered, there's been a misunderstanding. Maya is an excellent nurse, and I was simply trying to help her understand. Stop, Victor's voice cut through Sterling's attempt at backtracking. Don't compound your mistakes with obvious lies. I have detailed reports of your behavior toward my daughter, and I'll be reviewing every personnel decision you've made over the past year. The conference room had become a tomb. Manning and the other administrators sat in stunned silence, realizing they had participated in the termination of the chief of surgery's daughter based on fabricated charges of insubordination. Furthermore, Victor continued, I'll be initiating an immediate investigation into discriminatory practices within the cardiac unit. Any staff member who has experienced similar treatment will be encouraged to come forward without fear of retaliation. Maya looked around the table at the faces of people who had been ready to end her career minutes earlier. Now they understood that she hadn't been an isolated target. She had been the daughter of their most powerful colleague, someone whose influence extended throughout the hospital and beyond. Maya, her father said gently, I'm coming down to the cardiac unit now. I think it's time for Dr. Sterling and I to have a face-to-face conversation about his future at Metropolitan General. As Maya ended the call, the transformation in the room was complete. Sterling no longer looked like a powerful department supervisor asserting his authority. He looked like a man whose career was about to end in disgrace. Manning and the administrators were already calculating the damage control that would be necessary to prevent this incident from becoming a public relations disaster for the hospital. But the consequences were just beginning to unfold. Everyone just realized they had made a terrible mistake. Doctor Victor Washington's arrival in the cardiac unit 10 minutes later was like watching a force of nature in action. At 52, he carried himself with the quiet authority that came from decades of making life-and-death decisions under pressure. His presence immediately commanded attention from every person in the unit, from senior physicians to housekeeping staff. He was not a tall man, but his bearing made him seem larger than his physical dimensions. His silver-touched hair was perfectly groomed, his surgical scrubs were immaculate, and his dark eyes carried the kind of focused intelligence that had made him legendary in cardiac surgery circles. The conversation in the cardiac unit stopped as Victor walked directly to the conference room where Sterling, Manning, and the administrators were still trying to process what had just happened. Maya stood beside the nurse's station, watching her father with a mixture of pride and concern. "Dr. Sterling," Victor said as he entered the conference room, his voice carrying calm authority that made Sterling's earlier bluster seem pathetic by comparison. "I believe we need to discuss your management philosophy and its impact on patient care in this unit." Sterling attempted to stand, but his legs were unsteady. The confident department supervisor who had been terrorizing Maya for months had been replaced by a middle-aged man, facing the destruction of everything he had worked to build. "Dr. Washington, I want to apologize for any misunderstanding." "There's no misunderstanding here, Richard." Victor's use of Sterling's first name was deliberate, stripping away the formal titles that Sterling used to assert his authority. "You systematically harassed my daughter because her competence threatened your sense of control. You retaliated against her for providing excellent patient care, and you attempted to destroy her career because she refused to be intimidated by your prejudices." Victor pulled out a tablet and began reading from detailed notes. "Over the past 6 months, you've documented 17 performance issues related to Maya's clinical judgments. In every single case, her assessments were medically sound, and her interventions improved patient outcomes. Yet you characterized her competence as insubordination." Manning tried to intervene. "Dr. Washington, I think we can resolve this situation without—" "Patricia, you participated in terminating an exemplary employee based on fabricated charges. The fact that she's my daughter makes this personal, but the pattern of discrimination makes it institutional." Victor turned his attention back to Sterling. "Richard, I've reviewed your personnel decisions over the past 3 years. You've driven away 4 highly competent nurses, all of them women of color who challenged established protocols in ways that improved patient care. That's not management, it's systematic discrimination." Sterling's voice came out as a croak. "Dr. Washington, I never intended—" "You intended exactly what happened. You used your authority to punish competence that made you uncomfortable, and you justified it by claiming insubordination when staff members demonstrated medical knowledge that exceeded your expectations." Victor's calm delivery made his words more devastating than shouting would have been. Maya's identification of electrolyte abnormalities in the Martinez case prevented cardiac arrest during catheterization. Her assessment of digoxin toxicity in the Chen case prevented fatal arrhythmias. Her clinical judgments have consistently improved patient outcomes, yet you treated her expertise as a problem to be solved. The door to the conference room opened, and Janet Rodriguez entered hesitantly. Dr. Washington, excuse me for interrupting, but I wanted you to know that Maya saved at least 3 lives during her time here. Her clinical assessments were always accurate, and her patient advocacy was exactly what we should expect from exceptional healthcare professionals. Victor nodded to Janet with appreciation. Thank you, Janet. That's exactly the kind of perspective I need to hear. More staff members had gathered outside the conference room, drawn by the unprecedented sight of the chief of surgery conducting a personnel investigation in person. Among them were nurses who had witnessed Sterling's treatment of Maya, physicians who had benefited from her clinical insights, and support staff who had observed the systematic harassment. Dr. Washington, said Dr. Chen, the cardiologist who had worked with Maya during the Martinez emergency, I want to go on record that Maya's clinical judgment during that case was outstanding. Her identification of the electrolyte problems prevented serious complications, and her knowledge of cardiac pharmacology was impressive for any healthcare professional, regardless of their position. Victor made notes as Dr. Chen spoke, building a comprehensive record of Maya's actual performance versus Sterling's documented criticisms. Richard, Victor said, returning his attention to Sterling, you have 2 choices. You can resign your position immediately and leave Metropolitan General quietly, or you can face a formal investigation that will examine every personnel decision you've made and every discrimination complaint that's been filed against you. Sterling looked around the room desperately, searching for support that no longer existed. Manning and the administrators were already distancing themselves from his decisions, and the clinical staff were clearly supporting Maya's version of events. I think resignation would be best for everyone, Sterling mumbled. I think you're right, Victor agreed. Security will escort you out of the building. Your resignation will be effective immediately. As Sterling gathered his personal belongings under security supervision, the transformation in the cardiac unit was already beginning. Staff members who had been afraid to challenge his authority were openly discussing improvements to patient care protocols and working relationships. But the changes were just getting started. The consequences were just beginning. Within 2 hours of Sterling's resignation, news of the incident had spread throughout Metropolitan General like wildfire. The story of the chief of surgery's daughter being fired for excellent patient care, only to be vindicated when her identity was revealed, captured the attention of every department in the hospital. Victor called an emergency meeting of the hospital's senior leadership, including the chief medical officer, director of nursing, human resources director, and department heads from every major unit. The conference room on the administrative floor was packed with executives who understood that they were facing a potential crisis that could damage the hospital's reputation and expose them to legal liability. Ladies and gentlemen, Victor began, his voice carrying the authority that had made him one of the most respected physicians in the institution, we have a serious problem that requires immediate attention and comprehensive solutions. He activated the room's presentation system, displaying a timeline of Maya's employment that documented every incident of harassment, every instance of retaliation, and every example of discriminatory treatment she had endured. My daughter was subjected to systematic harassment for 6 months, while providing exceptional patient care that saved lives and improved outcomes. The discrimination she faced was not subtle or accidental. It was deliberate and sustained, designed to drive her out of the hospital for demonstrating competence that threatened established hierarchies. Dr. Margaret Foster, the chief medical officer, reviewed the documentation with growing concern. Victor, this represents potential liability that could expose the hospital to significant legal and financial consequences. The legal exposure is secondary to the ethical failure, Victor replied. We allowed a department supervisor to terrorize a competent healthcare professional because her clinical knowledge and patient advocacy challenged his sense of authority. Patricia Manning, who had participated in Maya's termination just hours earlier, looked distinctly uncomfortable. Dr. Washington, we followed established procedures for addressing performance issues. The documentation showed a pattern of problems. The documentation showed a pattern of excellence being reframed as insubordination, Victor corrected sharply. Maya's clinical assessments were consistently accurate, her patient outcomes were superior, and her advocacy for patient safety exemplified the highest standards of medical ethics. Yet she was punished for demonstrating exactly the kind of competence we claim to value. The Human Resources Director, James Fletcher, was taking detailed notes as Victor spoke. Dr. Washington, what specific changes are you recommending to prevent similar incidents? I'm not recommending changes, I'm implementing them, Victor announced. Effective immediately, Metropolitan General will establish a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination and retaliation. Any supervisor who uses their authority to harass competent staff members will face immediate termination. He continued outlining comprehensive reforms: mandatory bias training for all supervisors, independent review boards for personnel disputes, transparent reporting mechanisms for discrimination complaints, and regular audits of personnel decisions to identify patterns of unfair treatment. Furthermore, Victor said, Maya will be reinstated immediately, not as a staff nurse, but as supervisor of clinical excellence for the cardiac unit. Her job will be to ensure that patient care standards are maintained and that staff members are evaluated based on competence rather than compliance with arbitrary hierarchies. The promotion was strategic. By elevating Maya to a supervisory position, Victor was sending a clear message that clinical excellence would be rewarded rather than punished, and that the hospital was serious about transforming its culture. Doctor. Foster nodded approvingly. Victor, these reforms address systemic issues that go beyond Maya's individual case. We've probably lost other talented staff members to similar discrimination over the years. Which is why we're implementing a comprehensive review of all personnel decisions made in the past 3 years, Victor announced. Any staff member who believes they've been subjected to discriminatory treatment will be encouraged to come forward, and we'll investigate every complaint thoroughly. Manning looked increasingly uncomfortable as the scope of the investigation became clear. Dr. Washington, that level of review could be very disruptive to hospital operations. Less disruptive than allowing discrimination to continue, Victor replied. We're going to examine every termination, every disciplinary action, and every performance evaluation to identify patterns of bias that may have driven away competent healthcare professionals. Within hours of the meeting, stories began emerging from staff members who had witnessed or experienced similar treatment. Nurses described being criticized for demonstrating clinical knowledge that exceeded supervisors' expectations. Physicians talked about colleagues who had been marginalized for challenging established protocols that were outdated or ineffective. Support staff shared examples of discrimination based on race, gender, or educational background. The investigation revealed that Sterling's behavior was not an isolated incident, but part of a broader culture that punished excellence when it came from unexpected sources. Multiple departments had lost talented employees who had been driven away by supervisors who felt threatened by competence that challenged their authority. Maya, meanwhile, was adjusting to her new role as supervisor of clinical excellence. Her first initiative was to establish mentoring programs for staff members who demonstrated clinical insights that went beyond their formal job descriptions. Instead of being punished for excellence, these employees would be supported and encouraged to develop their skills further. Maya, Janet Rodriguez said as they reviewed patient care protocols, I have to admit, when you first started here, I knew there was something different about you. I just never imagined it was because you'd grown up learning medicine from one of the best cardiac surgeons in the country. Maya smiled, the first genuinely relaxed expression she had displayed in months. I wanted to succeed based on my own merits, not because of my family connections. But I learned something important from this experience. What's that? Sometimes you have to use whatever power you have access to, not just to protect yourself, but to change systems that harm other people who don't have the same advantages. The transformation of Metropolitan General was just beginning, but already the hospital was becoming a model for how healthcare institutions could support excellence while eliminating discrimination. But the changes were far from over. 6 months after Sterling's departure, Metropolitan General Hospital had become a case study in institutional transformation. The reforms Victor had implemented had not only eliminated discriminatory practices, but had actually improved patient outcomes, staff retention, and the hospital's national reputation. Maya's role as supervisor of clinical excellence had evolved into something unprecedented in healthcare administration. She worked directly with staff members at all levels to identify opportunities for improving patient care, regardless of whether those insights came from nurses, physicians, technicians, or support staff. Her office had become a destination for healthcare professionals who had innovative ideas, but had previously been afraid to share them. "The difference is remarkable," Dr. Chen told a group of medical students during their rotation through the cardiac unit. "6 months ago, we had rigid hierarchies that discouraged clinical input from anyone below a certain level. Now we encourage everyone to contribute their observations and insights, and our patient outcomes have improved significantly." The statistics supported her assessment. Medication errors had decreased by 40% since the implementation of collaborative care protocols. Patient satisfaction scores had reached the highest levels in the hospital's history, and staff turnover had dropped to virtually zero, as healthcare professionals, who had been considering leaving other institutions, specifically requested transfers to Metropolitan General. Maya's success had not gone unnoticed in the broader medical community. She had been invited to speak at healthcare conferences about eliminating discrimination in medical settings, and her protocols were being adopted by hospitals across the country. "The key insight," Maya explained to a packed auditorium at the American Hospital Association's annual meeting, "is that clinical excellence can come from anyone, regardless of their formal position or educational background. When you create systems that evaluate ideas based on their merit rather than their source, you unlock tremendous potential for improving patient care." The audience included hospital administrators, department heads, and healthcare professionals from across the United States, all seeking solutions to persistent problems with staff retention, patient outcomes, and workplace culture. Dr. Victor Washington, who had been invited to present alongside his daughter, outlined the structural changes that had made Metropolitan General's transformation possible. The most important reform was establishing independent review processes for personnel decisions, he explained. "When supervisors know that their actions will be evaluated by impartial committees that include staff representatives, they become much more careful about distinguishing between legitimate performance issues and personal biases." The reforms had attracted national attention from medical journals, healthcare policy organizations, and civil rights groups. Metropolitan General's approach to eliminating discrimination while improving patient care was being studied as a model for institutional change in healthcare settings. But perhaps the most significant transformation was in the daily culture of the hospital itself. Staff members who had previously been afraid to speak up were now actively contributing to patient care discussions. Hierarchies still existed, but they were based on expertise and experience, rather than arbitrary assumptions about who was qualified to have clinical insights. "Maya," Janet Rodriguez said as they completed their shift, "I have to tell you something. Before you came here, I was thinking about leaving nursing entirely. The constant pressure to stay quiet, to not ask questions, to accept decisions without understanding the reasoning, it was crushing my love for patient care." Maya looked up from the patient charts she was reviewing. "What changed your mind? Watching you fight for excellent patient care, even when it cost you personally. You showed me that being a healthcare professional means advocating for patients, not just following orders. And now with the new systems in place, I feel like my experience and insights are actually valued." Maya smiled, understanding that Janet's experience represented the broader transformation that had occurred throughout the hospital. That's exactly what these changes were supposed to accomplish. Excellence in healthcare comes from everyone working together, sharing their knowledge and focusing on what's best for patients. The success of Metropolitan General's reforms had also attracted the attention of national policymakers who were looking for solutions to persistent problems in American healthcare. Maya had been invited to testify before Congress about discrimination in medical settings and the potential for institutional reforms to improve both working conditions and patient outcomes. The lesson from Metropolitan General, Maya told the House Subcommittee on Health, is that when you eliminate discrimination and create systems that value competence over hierarchy, everyone benefits. Patients receive better care, healthcare professionals are more satisfied with their work, and institutions become more effective at fulfilling their mission. As Maya returned to her office after the congressional hearing, she reflected on how much had changed since that morning when Sterling had fired her for providing excellent patient care. The young woman who had been intimidated and harassed for demonstrating clinical knowledge had become a national advocate for healthcare reform. Her phone rang, displaying her father's number. "How did the hearing go?" Victor asked. "Really well. The committee seemed genuinely interested in replicating our reforms in other healthcare systems. I'm proud of you, Maya. You turned a personal injustice into a catalyst for systemic change that's helping healthcare professionals across the country." Maya looked out her office window at the bustling cardiac unit, where she had once been afraid to demonstrate her clinical knowledge. Now it was a place where excellence was celebrated regardless of its source, where patient care was truly collaborative, and where discrimination had been replaced by mutual respect and shared purpose. The transformation was complete, but Maya knew that the work of maintaining these changes would be ongoing. Discrimination and bias were persistent problems that required constant vigilance and commitment to overcome. But she had proven that individuals could challenge systems, that excellence could triumph over prejudice, and that institutional change was possible when people had the courage to demand better. Her story had become more than a personal victory. It had become a blueprint for creating healthcare environments where every professional could contribute their best work in service of patient care, regardless of their background or position in traditional hierarchies. The phone call that had revealed her identity as the chief of surgery's daughter had not just saved her career, it had transformed an entire institution and inspired reforms that would benefit healthcare professionals and patients for generations to come. Thank you to everyone who typed respect. Your support for healthcare workers means everything. If these stories inspire you, please subscribe to join our community and help us share more incredible tales of courage and justice in healthcare. Until next time, keep believing in the power of standing up for what's right.